pomeriggio. Hello from Rome. It is a pleasure to see so many of you again today. But for our newest participants, my name is Silvia Dall'Olio and I serve as the Executive Director here at the Rome Global Gateway. Our time together has flown, and today we welcome you all to the fourth and unfortunately last appointment with this series, A Hell of a City, Dante's Inferno on the Road to Rome. Professors Ted Kacchi, David Lummis, and Chiara Sbordoni from the Center of Italian Studies and the Rome Global Gateway, respectively, have been our valiant guides these past few weeks, and we cannot thank them enough for the expertise and the passion that they have shown us in this journey. Professor David Lummis, unfortunately, could not be with us here today, as exactly at this time he's teaching his own course to Notre Dame students who have returned to campus this week. He sent all of us this message that I'm going to read very briefly right now. I regret not being there tonight, but I hope you found the readings, videos, and discussions meaningful, and I wish you all the best in your continued encounter with Dante, Rome, and Italian culture. Ted and Chiara, please convey to him how grateful we are for his presence so far. Last week in our third meeting, we read Canto 13 of Dante's Inferno and discussed the suicide of Pierre de Levigne. We examined how Dante reacts to Pierre's speech as a pilgrim and considered why, as the author of the comedy, he condemned him to damnation. If you missed last week's discussion, you can view the event on the Think and Be YouTube channel. Today, our discussion will focus instead on Inferno 18 and Inferno 27, where Dante conjures up the figure of his great enemy, Pope Boniface VIII. In Inferno 18, through a reference to the Pope's Jubilee in the year 1300, and in Inferno 27, through the encounter with Boniface's false counselor, Guido da Montefeltro. As I was mentioning, today concludes the series on Dante, but our Rome Book Club Journey to Italy, Viaggio in Italia, continues. We are hard at work on the next series, which will be on sacred music and feature J.J. Wright, who is the director of the University of Notre Dame Folk Choir, and will start on March 10th. A word of gratitude to all the co-sponsors of the Journey to Italy Rome Book Club, the Rome Global Gateway, Notre Dame International, the Center for Italian Studies, and the Notre Dame Alumni Association, as well as all the team members that make this event possible. Tonight, I would especially like to thank our very own Costanza Montanari and Danilo Domenici from the Gateway, without whom this series would not be possible. Our current number of registration is more than 450 people. Sorry, didn't put the camera back, all right. And representing participants from 11 countries worldwide. As always, if you have questions from the two faculty members tonight, please use the Google form that we're sharing with you right now. And we also have a private moderated discussion board on LinkedIn to continue the discussion, and the link for that discussion board is being shared with you right now. And now to Professors Ted Kacchi from the Center for Italian Studies on campus and Professor Chiara Sbordoni from the Rome Global Gateway. Thank you. Grazie for everything.
Thank you, Silvia. We're really delighted to see so many of you again for our last appointment. I'm so sorry this is ending. It's been just delightful. And we've really, I think I speak for all of the faculty, David and Chiara, when I say that we've really been inspired by the response of you and the questions and the discussions that we've had also in the breakout rooms after the meetings. So it's with a somewhat heavy heart that we've come to the end of our journey together, but we hope that we can stay in touch. As I said at the beginning, we hope that when you can next visit the campus, you'll be sure to contact David and me at Notre Dame through the Center for Italian Studies. Just drop us an email. We'd love to show you the Zam Dante collection in the library. And of course, when you're passing through Rome, you have to, that's the pilgrimage destination in Rome. is to go and visit the Rome Notre Dame Gateway. I was so happy to see many of you at the wonderful lectures that we had inaugurating the Dante in America series that is sponsored by the Center for Italian Studies. And I just wanted to extend an invitation to all of you again to join us. This lecture series will continue for the rest of this semester and also next fall, when we hope that the lectures can be held on campus. So if you're visiting next fall for football weekend, you can perhaps coincide with our lecture series. It's all listed on the Center for Italian Studies website, so I won't go through the whole list, but I wanted to mention that on February 19th, we're going to have our second session, and these are all starting at 12:30 Eastern Standard Time, when Christina Olson of George Mason University will talk about translations and iconographical traditions of Dante in America and North America. And Kathleen Boyle, a colleague from the University of Notre Dame, will talk about the Italian-American reception of Dante in the novel that many of you may know, Pietro di Donato's Christ in Concrete. These are all open to the public, so invite your friends to join us as well. And again, please be in touch. And as Dante scholars now, you are cordially invited to all the programs offered by the Dante Center at Notre Dame and the Center for Italian Studies. As has been our practice, we wanted to start with a couple of questions that had come in since our last meeting. And I wanted to start by asking Chiara to respond to a question that we had from Chicago about the second half of Inferno 13th that we didn't get to last time, Giacomo the Spendthrift. Why, Chicago asked, why is he at the same level as the suicides? And why does Dante appear to equate his sin with those of the suicides? Chiara?
Grazie Ted, buonasera a tutti. Thank you. So in the second ring of the seventh circle of violence, Dante punishes the violent against the self. So suicides and spendthrifts are both violent against the self. The suicides took their own lives, and we have already said that they won't recover their bodies at the end of times, but that their bodies will be hanging from the branches of the trees they have become. The spendthrifts instead are those who squander their property, so using their property in a irresponsible and self-damaging way, and their punishment is that of being chased by hunting dogs. So their violence against themselves regards their material possessions, basically not their own bodies, and yet it's still part of a self-damaging behavior. We also have a question from Arlington, Virginia, that I will address to Ted. I'm enjoying the Clive James translation for its readability, flow, and lack of footnotes. What is your estimate of that translation? And I know that.
I was really delighted to see this question. I'm an admirer of the Clive James translation. Several years ago, when it first came out, I believe it's 2013. I was on a two-week vacation, and so what does a Dante scholar do on vacation? I read the Divine Comedy in the Clive James translation, and I think that the best recommendation that I can give of the Clive James translation is that I read it from the beginning to the end. And in the question, I thought Arlington, Virginia picked up on the readability, flow, and lack of footnotes, which are three fundamental characteristics of the Clive James translation. If you look on the right, you can see that a couple of different innovations. In the first place, he doesn't use the terza rima, but he does have a rhyme scheme, which is by quatrains. So if you look at A, B-A-B. So there's an interlockedness in his rhyme scheme, but it also, he doesn't have the difficulty of having to make so many rhymes as the terza rima would require, and that the English language, as we've said before, is much more poor than the Italian language for rhymes. So his solution is to have a quatrain which has an interlocking rhyme that gives that forward movement. So when you're reading the Clive James translation, you're actually driven forward in the reading in a way that has an analogy, we might say, to the original. And the other point that I draw your attention to is that by writing it in quatrains, he actually creates more space for the English with respect to the Italian. And he uses the extra space, so to speak, of the English translation of the English to, as the reader from Arlington, Virginia noted, put in information that's not in the original to elaborate on the original. And he does it in a very, I would say, a very intelligent and a very controlled, judicious would be the word I would use, way. So if you look at, for example, at the midpoint, we all know this by memory now in the original, at the midpoint of the path through life, I found myself lost in a wood. The way ahead was blotted out. You can see he has a very vivid rendering of the original there. The keening sound I still make, that's not in the original. So he's actually putting in bits that are not in the original, but that maintain the flow and provide further elaboration on the original. He also, you'll notice the technical device called enjambment, or where the run-on lines. So whereas Dante's lines typically end at the end of a syntactic element, a clause or a sentence, Clive James runs them on. So the keening sound I still make, it's a run-on. As you shall hear, it led to good things too, eventually. But there and then I saw no sign of those, and can't say even how I had come to be there. Another run-on or enjambment, we would call it. So I guess that is the other characteristic that contributes to this forward momentum of the Clive James translation. And so I think that it was a very good question to have. I think it's a very reputable and interesting translation. I think we were going to provide you with a review of it. I don't know if we can stick it in the chat now, but we will add to the materials the review from The Guardian of the Clive James translation. I think we should go on. Chiara, I think it's your turn.
Yes.
I'm going to have to take care of Beatrice here. I'll be right back. Go ahead.
Yes, I will make sure to make the article from The Guardian that Ted was referring to available in our resources to share it with you. I think that we are now ready to address the reading questions for this week, and this will take us to discuss Cantos 18 and 27, and finally encounter the Infernal Rome that inspired our book club. This hell of a city that Dante shows the reader at this midpoint through the first realm seems to be the backdrop of his pilgrimage through hell, along with the Rome to be of Aeneas and Virgil that we have encountered at the beginning of the poem in Canto 1, and along with the promise of a heavenly Rome, which will be the destination of the pilgrim at the end of Paradise in Canto 31. So I will ask Ted to identify the location in the map of hell of the sinners and describe the punishment the punishments of the sinners in these two cantos. So cantos 18 and 27, how do the locations in the Inferno express something about the nature of fraud? And how do the punishments or contrapassos express the nature of the specific sins punished in these cantos?
Chiara, can we have another look at the map? I think that's in the PowerPoint. And if you had a chance to look at the videos, this is these are the maps that are discussed there. On the left, this is the earliest. It's a woodcut from 1506, mapping Dante's Malebolge, Dante's evil pouches. And you can see Geryon, the monster Geryon, who brings Dante and Virgil on his shoulders all the way down this space that you can see on the right-hand side, the distance between the level of the circles of violence, RWP, the river, the wood, and the plain. And then you can see that precipitous drop that Geryon brings down the travelers to the 8th circle, which has 10 ridges on the right. And you can see the 10 divisions or 10 bolge of Dante's evil pouches. Now, the thing that I'd just like to point out is that this these two zones of hell, these two circles, the 8th and the 9th, actually take up half of the space of the poem. So in other words, there's a discrepancy between the representation that you see on the right of the spaces. If you look at the textual space, he actually dedicates cantos 18 through 30 to the 8th circle, and then the rest of the poem, plus 4 rather, take us through the 9th circle. So 13 plus 4 is 17. Half of the 34 cantos of Dante's Inferno are taken up with fraud. And so this, of course, means that for Dante, fraud is the big problem in his society. And fraud is lowest in hell because it's the misuse of man's highest attribute, his intellect. The theme of human intellect and its misuse explains another characteristic of Malebolge, which is all of the architectural and urban structures that you encounter in these cantos. And I'm thinking in contrast to what we've seen in the Circle of Violence, where it was natural settings. Malebolge is the city of man. It's man's intellect. It's man's culture, his urban invention. This also explains, I think, this higher intellectual component of sin accounts for the greater complexity and articulation of the poem structure itself. For example, the relationship and the transition between the cantos and the relationship between the represented spaces of the fiction and the spaces of the representation. And if you looked at the video, you saw how I mapped, it's kind of interesting. If you read these cantos, it seems just like chaos. But in fact, there's a very careful measuring of 2 cantos for one bolgia for one canto, and so on. There's a kind of architecture of the poet in drawing up these evil pouches. And finally, I would like to mention that the Malebolge is perhaps the most intensely meta-literary part of the poem. By meta-literary, I mean those passages in the poem where the poet actually calls attention to the making of the poem as an artifact. And I'm sure you noticed some of this in your reading. A very simple example is the beginning of Inferno 20, where he writes, "Of strange new pain, I now must make my verse, giving matter to the canto numbered 21 of this first canzone, which tells of the submerged." It's a fascinating opening to a canto, and he actually gives technical language. Okay, this is a canto. This is the 21st of the canzone or canticle. Dante's very self-conscious, and he's calling attention to the making of the poem in this part of the poem. Another example is at the beginning of Inferno 21, where he again references the title of the poem. Now, you'll notice in Canto 20, he had just referred to Virgil's poem as the Aeneid as a great tragedia, his tragedia, the tragedy of Virgil, the Aeneid as a tragedy. And Dante makes a point at the beginning of 21 to say, thus from one bridge to the next we came until we reached the highest point, speaking of things my comedy does not care to sing. So he's calling attention to the title of his poem. This is another example of a meta-literary feature of the poem that they're very intensely developed in this part of the poem. I think Dante is the most self-conscious poet, and he expresses a meta-literary self-awareness which is without precedent, and it's really unparalleled before the great modernists such as James Joyce. And I think this is due to the fact that he has such a profound appreciation for both the power of language and literature, but also their limitations. And so he's constantly playing both sides of those dimensions of his art. And Chiara and I had a big debate about this because she wanted to say, well, Ariosto, and there are other poets who show a similar level of artistic self-awareness. We didn't solve the debate, but I get the last word because I got this question, for which I would say that Dante actually, his reflection on the limits of language and of art to transcend the exilic condition of human identity, Dante brings a metaphysical dimension to his meta-literary awareness, which has a great depth, which is not easy to find elsewhere in the literary tradition. I'd like to turn now to ask Chiara to talk about the simile of the Jubilee Bridge. I'm going to read it, and I hope you all looked at the very exciting video that Danilo and our colleague Danilo and Chiara made in front of the Castel Sant'Angelo, which is a little bit of an on-site dimension to our course. It's a wonderful video, and this is exactly the same bridge that still exists in Rome, which Dante refers to in lines 25 through 33 of Canto 18. The sinners in its depth were naked, those on our side of the center coming toward us, the others moving with us, but with longer strides, just as, there's the simile, because the throngs were vast the year of Jubilee, the Romans had to find a way to let the people pass across the bridge, so that all those on one side faced the castle, Castel Sant'Angelo, heading over toward St. Peter's, and these on the other heading toward the Mount. Chiara?
Thank you, Ted. You were talking about how elaborate and complex the relationship between the space of hell, its architecture, and the space represented in it gets at this point in Malebolge or evil pouches. And indeed, I think that it is very significant that Dante places this image of Rome here at the entrance of Malebolge and of the 8th circle of fraud, which from the point of view of the text corresponds to the very midpoint of the first canticle of 34 cantos. So Dante is evoking Rome at the very center of hell, and when he starts treating fraud, and the image of Rome he's evoking mirrors an image of fraud in hell. Panderers and seducers in the first Bolgia are condemned to walk in circles, in 2 lanes in opposite directions for eternity, like the pilgrims who come and go from and to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome during the Jubilee year 1300 on the 2 lanes in which the Helen Bridge had been divided. So the Jubilee had been proclaimed by Pope Boniface VIII, Benedict Caetani, who had become Pope in 1295, and who was Dante's political nemesis, because he had had a major part in the politics of Florence. It was because of the Pope's involvement in Florence, supporting the Black Guelphs, the opposite political faction to Dante's own factions, the White Guelphs, that Dante's party had been defeated and that ultimately Dante had been exiled. Now Dante employs a very elaborate simile, and at this point we know that similes are one of his favorite rhetorical devices in the poem. And in this simile, he compares Boniface's pilgrims to Rome to the fraudulent sinners in hell. Not that implicitly, so Dante is casting a fraudulent shadow on Boniface's Jubilee and its pilgrimage. Now, if we think that most probably Dante had been in Rome that year 1300, possibly in those very days when the comedy is set during the Holy Week, the simile seems also to suggest a comparison between Dante the character's pilgrimage through hell and the pilgrimage to Rome promulgated by Pope Boniface VIII. The way that Dante here parodies Boniface's pilgrimage is a way of asserting that his own pilgrimage in the poem represents an alternative pilgrimage to Rome. In fact, the theme of Rome will be continued in the Purgatorio and then the Paradiso, where it is evoked to punctuate the progress of the pilgrim, so to speak, of the pilgrim poet on his journey to salvation. And perhaps we can say more about this at the end of our meeting today. But for now, going back to the complexity of lower hell and its architecture and the way that the text weaves together images of the landscape of hell with the represented space within the poem, the image of Rome is the first of a series of images of Italian cities that constitute a watermark, we could say, of this part of the Infernal journey, that also becomes a journey through a dystopian Italy, through iconic monuments of the cities surveyed in the Malebolge cantos. And just to give you some examples from Malebolge, at the end of this same Canto 18, Bologna is characterized by its language, and Lucca is represented by one of the damned souls. In Canto 19, Dante evokes Florence's baptistry, where he had been baptized, and Mantua in Canto 20, and Lucca in Canti 21 and 22, Venice and its bridges in 23, and Pistoia in 25, and you have read Canto 27 with the depiction of Romagna and 8 of its cities. So Malebolge is probably the part of hell in which Dante's political perspective is most developed in hell. This dystopic Italy is a fragmented country whose cities and regions are plagued by the feuds among political factions, the Ghibellines and the Guelphs, and behind them, the big actors of the political stage, the popes and the emperors and kings. The reference to Rome at the entrance of Malebolge so introduces the theme of the church incarnated in Pope Boniface, which will be further developed in Canto 19, leading up to Canto 27. But the theme of the church, as it is developed in these cantos, is central to Dante's political view, which will be developed later on in his treatise on monarchy, which theorizes the complementarity of two powers. On the one hand, the spiritual power of the Pope, whose sole preoccupation, according to Dante, should be the pastoral care of the faithful, the moral salvation of Christians. And on the other hand, the temporal power of the emperor, who should guarantee the peace and governance of cities and countries. So in Inferno 19, in fact, Dante meets Pope Nicholas III, who had died in 1280, and who is damned for simony, which is the selling of sacred things, in particular church offices. He's stuck head down in a hole, his feet without the hole burned by flames, a clear parody of the Pentecostal fire that inspires the apostles and of the anointment of the feet. Nicholas is waiting for his successor, Boniface VIII, and he even mistakes Dante for Boniface. So Dante here is prophesizing Boniface's damnation to hell. Now, within this context, Dante pronounces a passionate political invective against the corruption of the church, while at the same time reviewing the history of the church itself from its foundation with Christ and Peter to present, denouncing the popes who abdicated their spiritual mission to get involved with secular power up to the French Pope, Clement V, who in 1309, so about the time when Dante was writing the poem, and Inferno in particular, will transfer the Roman Curia from Rome to Avignon in southern France under the influence and the control of the French king, Philip IV. Now, in Canto 19, Rome is thus depicted in apocalyptic overtones, we can say. Christian Rome is viewed as the prostitute of the kings, and I'll show you a slide with just the text, if I can get to it ever. Here we go. Sorry, I prefer like this for now. And
Back the other way, Chiara. That's better the other way.
Yes, just a moment. I will make it bigger in a second. And so Dante dates the root of this corruption back to the alleged donation of the city of Rome and the Western Roman Empire to Pope Sylvester in the 4th century from the part of Emperor Constantine after the Pope cured him from leprosy. And the emperor had converted to Christianity. And I will show you the entire fresco in the slide here, and you're right. Okay, so here we go. So you can see from in the picture, this is a fresco that decorates the walls of the Chapel of San Sylvester in the Church of Santi Quattro Coronati, a few blocks from the Rome Global Gateway here. And it's part of a cycle of frescoes which really are promoting the church political propaganda in the 1240s. And you can still visit it and admire the frescoes. You see the Emperor Constantine offering the Pope the attributes of power, so the tiara, the umbrella, and the white horse here. So this whole program that Dante establishes in Canto, this whole representation that, and this apocalyptic representation of Rome that Dante offers the reader in Canto 19 leads up all the way to the treatment of Boniface, again in Canto 27, which now I would ask you, Ted, to introduce at this point.
Well, I'm gonna be very short in terms of the introduction by just mentioning the contrapasso in this canto. It goes together with Inferno 26 and 27. All of these sinners are contained in tongues of fire. They are false counselors. And so their punishment is to be wrapped up in these flames, which is an evident parodic allusion to the tongues of flame that appear on the heads of the apostles at Pentecost when they were granted the gift of tongues in order to convert the world to Christ. So this is one of the most exquisite examples of Dante's contrapasso, where he connects the biblical, Pentecostal, prophetic eloquence, language, and contrasts it with the false counsel of, in Canto 26, Ulysses, the heroic classical figure, and in Inferno 27, the modern political counselor. I think we want to go to the passage, Chiara, as soon as possible. Let me just say, before we read the passage, and I hope, Chiara, you would read it and we have it in the facing page, Inferno 27, 58 through 129. For the last time, we'll hear Chiara read in Italian. I don't know how many of you noticed that Guido da Montefeltro is kind of a Machiavellian figure, before Machiavelli, 200 years before Machiavelli, if you will. There's no question that Machiavelli would have been very attentive to this canto of Dante's. Machiavelli was most, probably the greatest Renaissance reader of Dante. And there's a great book to be written there. Inferno 27 is concerned with the Romagna, which was under the control of the church state or papacy during the medieval and Renaissance periods, actually all the way up until the unification. And the Romagna was accordingly famous for its political instability. The popes were not very good rulers over the Romagna. There was constant war between the different principalities and cities of the Romagna because the Pope was not a very good, effective prince of the political scene in Italy. The analysis that Dante the Pilgrim gives to Guido on the current state of the Romagna in the first part of the canto, you can go back to this at your leisure, verses 25 through 60, is absolutely Machiavellian in its analytical, political tone. The key chapters of Machiavelli's Prince, if you recall, are dedicated to the violent suppression of the rebellious people of the Romagna by Pope Alexander's illegitimate son, Cesare Borgia, 200 years later. So Machiavelli is perfectly coherent and consistent with the context of Dante's account of the Romagna here. And Guido da Montefeltro represents a kind of Machiavelli anti-litterum, but Dante is at pains to show that the shrewd and unscrupulous political counselor is not so smart. Why don't we read the passage, Chiara? Go ahead, and then we'll take turns trying to point out, again, this is the last example of, and it's been one of our standbys, is what's wrong with this picture. Read the speeches of the damned with skepticism. Learn how to read between the lines. And this is a wonderful speech for that. Chiara, would you put it up and read it? And then we'll take some, in the time that's remaining, I think we can go back and forth a few times and point out issues here.
I will share the screen with it, hopefully the right one. Let me see. Is it the right one, Ted?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So it starts at 61, se io credesse. Or if you want to go ahead.
Or 58, poscia che il fuoco.
Yeah, so you get the flame speaking.
Okay, from 58 then. Poscia che il fuoco, alquanto ebbe rubiato, al modo suo, l'aguta punta mosse di qua, di là, e poi diecco tal fiato. Si credesse che mia risposta fosse a persona che mai tornasse al mondo, questa fiamma staria senza più scosse. Ma però che giammai di questo fondo non tornò vivo alcun, s'io odo il vero, senza tema d'infamia ti rispondo. Io fui uom d'arme e poi fui cordigliero, credendomi sì cinto fare ammenda, e certo il creder mio venia intero, se non fosse il gran prete a cui malprenda, che mi rimise nelle prime colpe, e come quare voglio che mi intenda. Mentre ch'io forma fui d'ossa e di polpe, che la madre mi die l'opere mie non furono leonine, ma di volpe. Gli accorgimenti e le coperte vie io seppi tutte, e sì menai l'orarte, che al fine della terra il suono uscie. Quando mi vidi giunto in quella parte di mia età dove ciascun dovrebbe calar le vele e raccoglier le sarte, ciò che prima mi piacea, allor mi increbbe. E pentuto e confesso mi rendei, ai miser lasso, e giovato sarebbe. Lo principe de novi farisei, avendo guerra presso al Laterano, e non con Saracin né con Giudei, che ciascun suo nemico era cristiano, e nessuno era stato a vincer acri, né mercatante in terra di soldano, né sommo ufficio, né ordini sacri, guardò in sé, né in me quel capestro che solea fare i suoi cinti più macri. Ma come Costantin chiese Silvestro dentro Siratti a guarir della lebbra, così mi chiese questi, per maestro, a guarir della sua superba febbre. Domandommi consiglio e io tacetti, perché le sue parole parver ebbre. E poi ridisse, tuo cuor non sospetti, finor t'assolvo e tu mi insegni a fare siccome penestrino in terra getti. Lo ciel possio serrare e disserrare, come tu sai, però son due le chiavi che il mio antecessor non ebbe care. Allor mi pinser gli argomenti gravi, là il tacer mi fu avviso al peggio, e dissi, Padre, da che tu mi lavi di quel peccato, ov'io mo cader deggio, lunga promessa con l'attender corto ti farà trionfar nell'alto seggio. Francesco venne poi, com'io fui morto, per me, ma d'un di neri cherubini gli disse, non portar, non mi far torto, venirsene dai giù tra i miei meschini, perché diede il consiglio fraudolente, dal quale in qua stato li sono i crini, ch'assolver non si può chi non si pente, né pentere e volere insieme puossi per la contraddizione che non consente. O me dolente, come mi riscossi quando mi prese dicendomi, forse tu non pensavi che io loico fossi. A Minos mi portò e quelli attorse 8 volte la coda al dosso duro, e poi, che per gran rabbia la si morse, disse, questi è direi del fuoco furo, perch'io là dove vedi son perduto e sì vestito andando mi rancuro.
Thank you. What a language. And what a poet. I don't know if any of you know very sophisticated politically shrewd operators, either in business or politics, who in the end reveal themselves to be not so smart as they think they are. I think that Dante is really capturing a type here. And from the very beginning, the shrewd, brilliant, strategic thinker, Guido da Montefeltro, reveals that he doesn't have a clue. He doesn't realize that Dante is going to be coming back to Earth, and Dante is going to tell his story. So from the very beginning, I think we're supposed to see the speech in an ironic mode that, you know, Guido da Montefeltro doesn't quite get it. It's interesting, in the higher levels of hell, the sinners often want to be remembered. They want their glory to be brought back to earth, in the circles of violence in particular. In fraud, they don't want their fraud to be known. They hide their sins, so to speak. But anyway, to start the speech, I think it's highly ironic that Guido thinks Dante isn't going to be coming back to tell anyone about this story of his sin. Chiara, you want to point out another aspect of this speech that's problematic?
Yeah, sure. We were talking about what's wrong with this picture again. And I mean, it's evident that, like Francesca blames love, like Pierre de Levigne blames envy, the whole point of Guido da Montefeltro's speech is to blame the Pope, who misled him to believe that he could forgive him for a sin before Guido had not even repented yet, and for which he actually will not repent, and for which he will be damned to hell forever. And the irony is that he's advising the Pope to do exactly what he's doing, promising much with scant observance.
Yeah, exactly. So he puts in his own mouth, and he's unaware. There's a lack of self-awareness there. And then perhaps the high moment of this, well, the other thing is, you can get his personality. He's so proud of himself. He's so proud of his, what does he say? Cunning stratagems. I would like to tell you how and why. He's proud at one level. While I still kept the form in flesh and bones, I'm at 73 and following, my mother gave me, my deeds were not a lion's, but the actions of a fox. cunning stratagems and covert schemes. I knew them all and was so skilled in them. My fame rang out to the far confines of earth. He still is attached to his fame on earth. I think that, again, the reader, as readers of Dante's Inferno, we're supposed to say, what's wrong with this picture? Perhaps the key moment, though, is when he describes the discussion with Boniface at lines 94 and following, as Constantine once had Sylvester summoned from Soracte to cure his leprous sores. So this is exactly the story that Chiara was telling earlier. He's comparing his situation and Boniface to that of Constantine and Sylvester. So this man called on me to be his doctor and cure him of the fever of his pride. But the elements are reversed. In the original story, Constantine, the political leader, the political power, comes to the spiritual power for salvation, to be cured. In this case, it's the Pope who is coming to the political strategic master, the cunning, the shrewd Guido da Montefeltro. And in the speech, it's clear, I think, that Guido da Montefeltro is not aware of the irony of this juxtapositioning, that Dante wants the reader to recognize that that's the problem. This is the consistency of his ideology, his critique of the current church, which has usurped a political role which is appropriate to the empire. I think we're going to get too excited about this canto, Chiara, and run over time. Let's take a next step, and then I think we have some questions. Can
I just add one thing?
Yeah, please.
To the irony of the situation is that the reader already knows from Canto 19 that Boniface is waited in hell as well. So here we have a Boniface who pardons, who confesses and pardons Guido in a way which we saw is not successful, and he himself is condemned to end up in hell with the other Simoniac popes.
Now, we didn't want to leave you in hell, so we were trying to think of how we can get out of hell at this point. So I want to go back to my map of hell just to kind of point out to you the transitions that are going to get us out of this mess. If you go back to Geryon, the monster, it's interesting that at a certain point in upper hell, the guardians are kind of an obstacle to the passage of Dante and Virgil. But after, in fraud, they actually assist. Geryon carries Dante and Virgil down to the next level. In Inferno 31, the giant will take Dante and Virgil, the giant Antaeus will take Virgil and Dante in the palm of his hand and set them down on the frozen lake of Cocytus in Inferno 31. This is communicating to us the providentially determined journey of Dante and Virgil. We're moving on. We're getting out of this mess. And in fact, if you look at Inferno 34, where we encounter Lucifer, he's immobile. He's immobilized. It's the opposite of Milton's brilliant, mobile Lucifer. Dante's Lucifer is immobile, frozen, and Virgil and Dante actually climb on the body of Lucifer to exit the to exit from hell. And I'll just read the last lines of Inferno 34 because the Inferno does not end in hell. They climb on the body of Lucifer. They climb through a hole all the way through the center of the earth to the shore of purgatory. 34, 133 and following. Into that hidden passage my guide and I entered to find again the world of light. And without thinking of a moment's rest, we climbed up, he first and I behind him, far enough to see through a round opening a few of those fair things the heavens bear. Then we came forth to see again the stars. So we have exited the Inferno by the end of Canto 34. And Purgatory, we're basically on the shores of Purgatory at that point. And Purgatory is going to be the continuation of the journey to celestial Rome. Chiara, do you want to just point out the future itinerary briefly?
Yes, very briefly. And I just want to show you a slide on this. Dante will continue on his journey to Rome, but a totally different Rome. At this point, it's really the promise of an heavenly Rome. Just think that when he enters in Purgatory proper, in Canto 9 of Purgatory, he's going through one of the gates of Rome, the gate of the Temple of Saturn, where the treasury is, where the treasure of Rome is kept. And when he's at the top of the Mount of Purgatorio, Beatrice predicts that he will be forever a citizen with me of that Rome where Christ himself is Roman. He truly identifies the city of Rome with paradise. So much so that when in the end, at the end of the Commedia, almost in Paradiso 31, he is about to cross the threshold of the Empyrean. He compares the experience to that of the barbarians who come to Rome. If the barbarians coming from that region, which Alice covers every day, wheeling with her son in whom she takes delight, were dumbstruck at the sight of Rome and her majestic monuments, when the Lateran surpassed all other works of man, I, who had come to things divine from man's estate, to eternity from time, from Florence to a people just and sane, with what amazement must I have been filled. For his experience of arriving finally in heaven, in the Empyrean, and almost being able to contemplate God is compared to being in sight of Rome, of the Lateran.
Thank you, Chiara. I don't know if we have any questions, new questions. I see one, Chiara, that I think is very much in tone from Columbia, Maryland, since we have a few minutes left. We've seen Dante's jabs at church leaders, especially Boniface, and the behavior of the church throughout the poem. His comparison of the Jubilee crowd control on the bridge across the Tiber to the sinner's movements in Inferno 18 is fantastic. While we may smile and chuckle as Dante vents his frustration and dislike of Boniface, the church, politics, etc., did this literary revenge have repercussions for Dante as his poem was published and shared in the vernacular? I'm curious about the church's reception of Inferno. I somehow picture medieval Italians being both greatly entertained and scandalized by it. I'm just entertained.
That's great. I don't know about the reception of the church at Dante's time. I guess that, the poem circulated widely, orally in the beginning, and it wasn't printed until a few centuries afterwards. And I don't know if you have specific comments on the reception of the Church of Inferno, but...
Well, I think I would go back to, Chiara mentioned Dante's treatise, the Monarchia, which was actually his political tract in which he made the arguments for essentially a version of the separation of church and state. It's a political theory text, which is still taught in the political science departments today. That book was severely attacked by the Dominicans already in the 1330s. And there's a long tradition. This came up in the Dante in America lecture last week. There's a long tradition of Protestant readership of Dante during the early modern period, who, of course, including the Puritans and the Calvinists of the United States, who very much identified with Dante's critique of the popes and of the corruption of the papacy. So oddly enough, this aspect was not highlighted in the Italian reception of Dante's poem, but it's very important, for example, in the reception of England's reception of Dante's poem. And in fact, the other thing is that the Puritans and the Calvinists, they really are engaged by Dante's representation of hell. Jonathan Edwards, the American Puritans and Calvinists really resonate with Dante's Inferno in a way that is not the case in Italy. And Melville is an example of an American classic, an American author who's very much influenced by the Calvinist reception of Dante's Inferno. And we know that also Moby Dick is very influenced by Dante. He read Dante in the Carey translation, and we actually have his copy, Melville's copy of the Divine Comedy with his annotation. So it's pretty convincing evidence for the reception of, the importance of Dante for the history of American literature. But that's rather far afield from the original question. I think that the book was on the banned list pretty early, the Monarchia more than the poem. I think the poem might have been thought of as more not harmless, but as a fiction, as a poetic representation. The church at that time there wasn't yet the concept of a index of banned books. That's something that comes only with the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century. Things are a lot more wide open and fluid in Dante's period with regard to religious conformity, we might say, heresy, heterodoxy. Those are categories that become much more rigid in the early modern period rather than in the medieval period. Sylvia, I think we're getting close to our saying goodbye. I see there's a question about what articles or researchers work on how modern US political issues compare to Dante's political environment. If I could just take 60 seconds on that, Sylvia.
Of course.
To, again, in closing, invite you all to the Dante in America series of lectures that was inaugurated last week and that's going to continue on February 19th and then through next fall. Already in the first meeting, one of the most important issues is how Dante is interpreted during the Civil War on both sides of the abolition and slavery question, and also how Dante is received by African American literature already in the 19th century. He's a very influential author, so that the current debate about systematic racial injustice, the history of America that we're living through right now, that goes back to 1865, the Civil War. Dante is all wrapped up in that. And so one of the leading figures on this topic is a man named Dennis Looney, Looney, Dennis Looney, who wrote a book called Freedom Readers, a play on freedom riders and freedom readers of Dante. And Dennis will be one of the lecturers in the series. So I'm grateful for the question. I think Dante is relevant for understanding what we are living through now, and particularly the Inferno, I would say, as I'm sure you've picked up on during the reading and discussions that we've had. Thank you again so much for being with us. It's really been a kick. Sylvia?
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Chiara. Of course, thank you, David, who's now with us. It's been wonderful. We just opened up to possible like 3 more new book club series right there in the last 2 minutes. As you know, as always, we now move to the community circle, the breakout rooms. But before we do so, as not everybody may be joining, thank you sincerely to everyone for participating so faithfully through the whole series. As mentioned, there will be another one coming. You receive information on that. And yeah, thank you very much. When the pandemic will allow and you will come to Rome, we'll be very happy to receive you here at the gateway. The community circles, as you know, will last for 15 minutes. I invite you to discuss 2 questions that our faculty suggested that are, do you have any further thoughts on Guido da Montefeltro? And do you have any final questions or comments on the series or on Dante's comedy? We know that there are a few questions that maybe didn't get answered during the conversation that may be brought back to the community circles. For those of you who are joining the community breakout circles, note that we're opening the rooms now and you can see the 4 square in your Zoom menu. If you click on that button, you should be able to select the room you would like to join. And these are each named by the faculty name. If you don't have this option available, please follow the instructions that we're sharing right now in the chat, or give us a moment and we'll place you into a room. Thank you.